The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
My name is John Savicki, and I will be going through a couple examples, primarily focused on ERP procurements, but really this can apply to any type of software implementation. All right, so let's move on here. Okay, so some of these data points are not our own. These are just information you can find off the internet in terms of IT performance. 75%, and this is out of about 600 IT professionals, believe their IT procurements are doomed from the start. 61%, 57% take longer than anticipated and are not considered a success. Not a big deal because these aren't big size projects, right? Just multi-million dollar projects, huge overruns, and huge performance issues. So we've seen probably the biggest failure rates in IT or software than any other industry we've participated in, which really tells us there's a high need to try and do things differently, try to do things better than what you've done in the past. So I'll walk through really, as I said, two different examples of ERP procurements and hopefully some takeaways that you can get out of this. So the first one here, and of course this will be anonymous. This is a large city ERP procurement. I would say between $50 to $100 million. And they ran this procurement the traditional way, and they asked us to come in after the fact because the procurement, or I guess the delivery of this ERP, was a disaster. They're not sure if they're going to court or not, but basically they're trying to figure out, how did it go so wrong? How did we spend $50 million and we're getting a system that we can't actually use? So this is kind of our assessment of how they ran their procurement, going through their RFPs, solicitations. They really followed a traditional approach where we had the proposal period followed by the evaluation period, then the negotiation period. So let's talk about kind of some of the traditional items or approaches or processes that they implemented. The first thing I looked at was their schedule. They provided 8 weeks to propose. Now, just at first glance, looking at the schedule, I'm pretty impressed. I mean, 8 weeks is more time than I see a lot of clients giving vendors to propose. Normally it's like 4 to 6 weeks. So 8 weeks, appears to be really well thought of. So I'm impressed about that. Next, I looked at what requirements they had. And so I split it out between the software and the integrator, and you can see the numbers there. So about 15, 16 different major topics. I then dove into these topics, and number 5, which most, not just ERPs, but most IT procurements, you'll have some sort of response to all the technical requirements. This was an Excel file with drop downs. You can see 20 different Excel sheets on this file, and they had to provide a response to each one. This by itself was 1,400 different line items, which once again, on a large scale ERP is not shocking, but the vendors have to do what? Respond to each one of those items. And that's just one requirement, number 5. So taking a look at all the other items, I just roughly looked at how many questions they were asking with each each of these items, here's what we had. 1,600 items for software and 200 items for integrator, combined together, 1,900 different questions. All right, think about that, 1,900 different questions. Now, some of these questions are probably simple and straightforward, but some of them are going to require, 1 to 2 to 3 pages to respond. So at 1,900 pages, even if we assume half a page per response, I mean, you're still looking at 800 pages potentially to respond to all this. So now going back, is 8 weeks enough time? Right? Put yourselves into the shoes of a supplier. 8 weeks to respond to almost 2,000 questions. Right? If you assume it's 800 pages, that's almost 100 pages per week to write. So think about that from the supplier's perspective. How many suppliers are jumping out of their seats, so excited to respond to this, right? Probably zero. Now, they're going to respond because it's a large implementation, several years. But out of 2,000 questions, what percent of those responses do you think are going to be boilerplate, right? What percent is just going to be cut and paste off the shelf? Or do you think they're actually going to pull out a blank piece of paper and just start writing from scratch? It's not going to happen, right? So high likelihood that it's just going to be cut and paste material. The other thing to keep in mind as an owner, what is the odds that they might miss something? What's kind of sad is that out of this procurement, almost 50% of vendors were disqualified for missing something, right? 50%. So here they are spending 8 weeks doing their best to respond to something, and they missed one item and they were thrown out. I mean, that's not what an attractive client looks like, right? That's the opposite of an attractive client. So let's keep moving forward here. Next thing is the evaluation period. Well, what does that mean? That means we have to evaluate all of those responses, right? So we've asked for almost 2,000 questions. We have to evaluate all of the supplier responses. The evaluation committee consisted of 9 different individuals, and these were all senior level individuals, directors, AVPs, VPs. We had 5 different proposals. I believe we had 3 for the software, 2 for the integration team. Average proposal size, 742 pages. When you add that up, that's a total of 3,710 pages. Why is that important? Because this is the amount that what? Your evaluators have to read. Your 9 individuals have to do what? Read 3,710 pages to identify which is the right option to go with. Just to put that into perspective, for those of you that have used copy machines and you put in those reams of paper, we're talking about 7.5 reams of copy machine paper. 7.5 reams. That's what they had to read. How many of these evaluators do you think are jumping over joy, are super excited to read 7.5 reams of paper? That's wild, right? Well, we gave them 8 weeks to evaluate. Plenty of time, right? Well, so you look at that number, 8 weeks sounds like a lot, but it takes about 5 to 6 minutes to read a technical page, right? So not just to read it, but to try and understand it. So at 5 to 6 minutes, that's about 300 to 370 hours, which if you do that into a week, that's almost 8 to 9 weeks to read those proposals. Now, when I say 8 to 9 weeks, that's literally reading 8 hours a day, every day for 8 to 9 weeks. How many people, how many humans do you think can do that? Can read 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for 8 straight weeks, right? My gut tells me not one single evaluator did that. So if they didn't do that, what do you think these evaluators did? They just what? Skimmed through it. And until they saw a page that looked good, then maybe they read that page. Otherwise, they just scanned through it, right? So were the evaluators really evaluating apples to apples? Were they scoring it fairly? My guess is they didn't. Because keep in mind, these were senior executives. What are the odds that they didn't do any work for 8 weeks except read these proposals, right? The odds are probably zero, right? As senior executives, there's always things that come up. There's no way they did nothing but read 8 hours a day for 8 straight weeks. Now, on top of that, we also added in 35 hours of demos per software organization, right? So you multiply that, that's what? Over 100 hours just in demos. Once again, how many of these evaluators are like, yes, I can't wait to spend the next 3 weeks on top of the 8 weeks I read every page, but now I'm going to spend 3 more weeks just watching demos, right? There's just no way humans can go through all that, but that's what this organization did. Once they got through that, then they had a quick negotiation period, issued the award, and then all the problems started after that, right? So in essence, right, the signing of the award was just the start of what? Nothing but misery for the next few years for this organization. Results, the change order rate wasn't too high, and I'm not going to provide the exact numbers, but between 5 to 10%. The delay rate was big, almost a year behind schedule. But the biggest thing is that last item, satisfaction. Most of the people you talk to say that this new ERP system is not only worse than their 30-year-old system, but can't do like half the things it needs to do. Once again, $50+ million. Now, this isn't unique. This happens pretty frequently with not just ERPs, but large-scale IT implementations. So is there a better approach? Hopefully there is, because that's why you're going to stick around. We'll go through some alternative techniques that we've learned over the years on not necessarily how to make the procurement and the outcome perfect, but how to maximize your probability of success. So you may still have problems, but hopefully it's not a year delayed and only 15% satisfaction. So let's look at, and I forget how many items I have here, but the first one is to consider really the software versus the integrator. Once again, this doesn't just apply to ERPs. This could be on other large scale implementations where you have a different company that provides the software versus a company that does the integration. Now, on some of your smaller IT projects, those are the same company, but on larger projects, you may have different companies here. So let's talk about what the difference between the software and the integrators are. You know, the best kind of analogy we've used is like purchasing a car. So you have a car and the car represents the software. So you see the cars here, we have the Honda, the Toyota. Now, some evaluators will say the Honda's better, some will say the Toyota's better. In essence, they probably will both get you to where you need to go, but they may have some features that you may like here or there, right? And that could represent your HR team and your finance team. They may like this software over the others, but in essence, they probably can both work. Now, what makes software different than just buying a car is with software, you're also buying someone to drive you for the next 2 to 3 years, right? You're not just buying the car, you're buying someone to drive you. So in one instance, and that represents the integrator, you have someone that has an outstanding driving record versus someone that has a terrible driving record, right? That represents the integrator. So the integrator, what is, at least in our observations, is really what makes the biggest difference on these implementations. So you have the software, right, where it's one may be slightly better than the other, but then you have the integrator where you could see significant differences in performance. What's going to make or break the success of your implementation? What we're proposing, it's not going to be the software. It's going to be the integrator. That's where you're going to see the majority of your issues with this implementation. Now, from the organization side, we always say, well, wait, this software system we're going to have for the next 10 years. And that's true, right? Your integrator may only be around 2 years. But once again, just like the picture shows, if that integrator has no idea what they're doing, guess what? Your 10-year software program isn't going to be successful, right? The integrator really makes a difference. So step 2, or item 2, is using a 2-step approach. Now, what this means is basically we'll set up an RFP to run the software, and then we'll set up the second step to select the integrator. We would advise this because it allows you to really focus on the software and then the integrator versus trying to do everything at the same time. So on these large IT implementations, it's helpful to use a 2-step approach. Now, the difference here in what we've learned is with this 2-step approach, what you should not do is in step 1 of this software, you should not just select one software product. We're proposing that you actually pre-qualify 2 to 3 software products, right? So instead of just selecting one software, we're suggesting shortlist it to the top 2 to 3. Then bring in the integrators. What this does now is it provides you with maximum flexibility. It gives you the most leverage. If in step 1, you only do one software project or software product, you lose your leverage. That software company has the advantage now. The integrators are forced only to implement that product. When you have 2 to 3 software products, it now allows the integrators to give you options. So once again, one of those software products might be not as good as the other, but they could have a much better integration team. Item number 3 is backloading the efforts. So what this means is in your traditional approach, once again, most RFPs ask for everything up front. All right, in this previous example, like 4,000 pages up front. And then when we get to negotiations, we ask for almost nothing. It's just, give me the contract, negotiate the contract, the award is made. What we're proposing is to flip that. What we're proposing is minimize the amount of information you ask for up front and maximize the information you get at the end. What this does is it speeds up the process. It makes it easier for your suppliers, easier for your evaluators, and it can actually help you get a better outcome, right? That's key here. So we're going to flip things around. Okay, so if we flip it, what are the things we're going to look for? Really, to keep this as short and simple as possible, we would suggest asking for maybe an approach plan, their qualifications and experience, their ability to identify risks, issues, concerns, or challenges, and how to address those items, and then obviously cost. Now, these are the items that we would suggest the evaluators read and score. These items, we suggest keeping 3 to 5 pages max per topic, right? So now instead of getting a 700-page response that evaluators have to go through, now they're going to get 10 to 15 pages. Now you're sitting there thinking, wait, we're going to run a $50 to $100 million IT procurement and all we're going to get is 15 pages? Well, the answer is no. You're not going to just get that. You're going to get more pages, but you're going to get it a little bit later in the process. But yes, in terms of what you're going to evaluate in this first step, you are going to evaluate 10 to 15 pages. And it's all right. You don't have to be perfect. All we're trying to do is very quickly shortlist the firms that we know we're not going to work with, shortlist them out. Right. And in the next step, we'll get more information. So you're gradually getting to the one vendor. And once we get to that one vendor, they're going to give you all the details. But coming back, so the proposal, 3 to 5 major topics that should only be 3 to 5 pages each. That would be our recommendation. Now, in terms of the technical requirements, are we suggesting you're not going to have any technical requirements? The answer is no. You're still going to have your Excel file with 1,000 or 2,000 line items. But the difference here is instead of the suppliers responding to a comment to each item that now an evaluator has to read, the difference here is we're going to just automatically assign points to it. So if the vendor says out of the box, they get 10 points. Configuration 6 points, customization 3, not available 0. You can change the categories and the points, but what we're trying to explain is rather than having to read a response, all you have to do now is sum up the points. So now a supplier that can come in and say, hey, we have 100% out of the box, they get 1,000 points. And another vendor that has to do everything via customization, they may only get 300 points. Now, the question is, well, how do we know if they do it right? You're not going to know that at this stage. You're going to know that later in the process. So that's how we simplify things up front. Okay, item 5, our evaluation committee. Evaluation committee, we recommend having about 5 to 10 individuals on these large-scale implementations. Why don't we want just 3? Because if you have 5 or less, what happens is that one person can kind of skew all the results, right? So on these large, complex, risky procurements, you really should have between 5 to 7 or 5 to 10 different individuals. Bullet point 2, make sure none of them are bosses or supervisors to anyone else on the team. Should be kind of self-explanatory, but I've seen on a lot of these ERP procurements where you're going to have a boss and then you have 3 or 4 subordinates underneath them, right? What are the odds that they're going to contradict the boss? They're not, right? So you should always try to avoid having that. And then the other thing is you don't necessarily have to have your subject matter experts as part of your evaluation committee. Because what we're doing differently here is now the proposal is going to be high level, non-technical. Where we need our subject matter experts is at the last step, the clarification and negotiation phase, where once we get all the information, we've narrowed it down to our top rated vendor, that's where we can better use or best use our subject matter experts. They can come in, do all the deep dives and basically go through it. And is it a pass or fail at that point? Item number 6, product demonstrations. Our recommendation, 2 to 4 hours max, right? Even on an ERP implementation, right? You don't need to spend hours and weeks trying to figure out which is the most perfect product out there. All you're trying to do is weed out the vendors or the products that can't even do the basics of what you need, right? So you should structure your demo so it's very high level. Once again, coming back, what if your subject matter experts are like, well, we want to see if it does this, 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 and that. They can do that. When are we going to do that? In this last step here. Right? Clarification and negotiation. So up front, we're going to have a high level demo. When we get to the last step, at that point, if your SMEs want to have a 40-hour demo, we can do it there. But up front, it should be a high level demo to help us quickly weed out the software products that can't even do the basics. Number 7. Probably the most important part of your IT implementation. So traditional RFP approaches, most of them, especially in IT, will overlook the expertise of the actual people. And they'll do what is most commonly found in RFPs. They'll do a group presentation. And this really doesn't allow us to assess the capabilities of those true experts. And if you think about this, when you look at projects that go really well versus those that fail, most of the time, when the project goes well, or even if it doesn't go well, most of the time people don't say, wow, it was the RFP or it was the contract, right? Because you can have kind of the same RFP structure. On this project, it goes great. On the other project, it's a disaster. What happened? The same kind of RFP language, right? Same thing with the contract. You use the same contract framework. One project is a success, the other one it's not. The contract has nothing to do with performance, right? Now, you still need a contract, but the contract doesn't drive performance. In our experience, it's the people. The people is what drives performance. If you have an A team, guess what? It doesn't matter how good or bad your RFP or contract is, those people can make it a success. If you have a really bad team and you have the best contract, guess what? You're still going to have problems, right? So people make a difference. So how this should be different is, once again, in a typical presentation where you have a team come in, what you normally have is one or two people that do the majority of the talking. They typically dress well, look really well, talk really well, tell you everything you want to hear, promise you the world. And then once the contract's awarded, you never see them again, right? So they're the sales team, the presidents that are there to convince you to pick them. But then you have the other people there that you can see, like looking in their eyes, they have no clue what we're even talking about. And the risk is sometimes those are the individuals that will be assigned to running your contract. That's the risk. So what we would suggest is, if you're going to run a presentation, so you can still run a presentation, but on top of that, you should also run separate one-on-one interviews with the key personnel. This is like a job interview where they come in and you'll ask them a set of questions. You should only do this for about the top 3 to 5 individuals that will make or break your project or your procurement or your contract. In this case, your overall project manager, your HR lead, finance lead, maybe the integration lead or the change management lead, but really you want to keep it to about 5 people. Once again, interview them separately, individually, not as a team, not as a group. And all you need to do is spend 30, 45 minutes per person. This step is the most important step probably in your procurement process to help you identify the right team. Once again, this is the most important step. And this is what most RFPs skip, because you do a group presentation where the president, VPs, business development come in, promise you the world, you get sold on it, and then all of a sudden you have the C team come in to try and implement your $55 million software product. So as an example here, 3 different firms. You can see the PM, HR lead, finance lead, procurement lead, and their scores. Right? You can see the difference in scores. So all 3 may have different software products, and some might be better than the other, but they're not quite the same. But what the interviews do, it allows you to identify the expertise of those individuals that are going to be on your contract, trying to help you implement this software for the next 2 years. This is an actual example from a different ERP. Real scores here. And you can see we've highlighted green, red, yellow. What's interesting in this case study is firm B and C were actually the same integration team. So they're actually the same integrator. But what we did is, because we shortlisted multiple software products, they gave us different teams for each product. So although this is the same integrator, they sent us different people that would integrate software A versus software B. Right now, in this case, both of their teams were pretty good. But what it shows you is that if you only were to shortlist one software product, you might only be getting the C team from the integrator, where they could have the A team available for a different product. So it's really important to not shortlist just to one software product. Vendor B gets the award. Now, looking at those numbers, guess what? Where is their biggest problem after award? Right? No surprise, it's on the HR module. And so very quickly, not only did the vendor, but the client both said, hey, we think we might need a different HR lead. Right? But we knew that up front. We could see that through the interviews. Right? And so that integrator actually switched that person out in the project. But the project went great because we focused on the people. Last item in procurement is to pre-plan and clarify your project. So once again, in traditional RFPs, once you get to that negotiation stage, typically it's just negotiate the contract. The lawyers get together, they work out the contract. What we're suggesting to do differently is, while the lawyers are doing that, in parallel to that, your organization gets together with the experts from the supplier organization, and you start to clarify your scope. You start to validate the proposal. You start to pre-plan the activities, right? Some of this you normally do right after award. What we're suggesting is do it before award. Why? You have the time, right? While you're negotiating a contract, you normally have 2 to 3 months to do this. Why not use that time to start ironing out some of these details, but also, more importantly, make sure that you didn't make a mistake, that the supplier didn't overlook anything, right? And that's what we would suggest doing during this modified clarification and negotiation period. Okay, last item here is that, we focused today really on procurement and some of the procurement strategies that you can do differently. We haven't talked anything about change management. Now, on these large scale IT implementation, change management is probably more important than your procurement process. And when we say change management, this isn't just like, oh, get someone to give you a change management plan, write this document, put it away and never use it. That's not what we're talking about with change management. You actually have to have a real plan that the organization buys into before you even start procurement. So in the ERP examples, at least that I've run that have gone really well, yes, we've done procurement differently, but the other thing that was done is those organizations really had a change management plan that had change agents. They benchmarked all of their data up front. Why? Because they knew that if something goes wrong in the future, they can now look back and say, well, no. Here's the benchmarks of how long things were really taking. This is what we were really doing. If you don't have that up front, it's going to be hard 3 years later, once you're trying to do this new implementation, to look back and say, well, how were things really done in the past, right? So you have to have your benchmarks. You have to have a realistic timeline. You have to have a legit communication plan that you use, training plan, and a leadership plan. So the leaders have to be educated and trained on how to help implement the change management activity, right? So there's a lot that goes into, or should go into, this type of effort before you even start thinking about the procurement. So anyway, that's kind of all I had. Went through that pretty quickly here, so I'll pause this here. And I guess we'll open it up to questions.
Perfect. Thank you, John. You can undo your share there. And I do have a few
Okay.
questions that came up in the chat, and then we'll open it up to the floor for any additional questions and experiences to share. One question earlier was on how often has this approach been protested that we have seen, and what are our experiences there?
How often has the traditional been protested?
No, some of the traditional protests, I think, in IT are more
Happens all
common
the
than
time.
happens
Yeah.
all the time. Yeah. How many protests have you seen in something like this? And then secondly, we can broaden that, because I
Yeah.
put in the chat, I don't think we've seen a protest on this specific approach before.
Yes. So we've never been protested using these concepts, because there's more to it than what I've just gone through. So we've never been protested on any sort of IT implementation. We've seen some protests in the past, and I would say maybe 15, 20 years ago, where, vendor just protested because they said, hey, this wasn't fair because we didn't win. Well, that's not a real valid protest. So no, we haven't seen protests on implementing these processes. Now, it doesn't mean you won't, right? You could still see one, but the opportunity to be protested should go down when you have a process that's more transparent and more fair.
Yeah, I would say that you can minimize the potential for a protest, but you can never stop it, and you can set yourself up to be able to win, because someone can protest anything. Someone could protest and say, we think the sky is orange, and I'm protesting. You can't stop that. You'll dismiss it right away, but you can get protested. So we have seen a couple of funny ones over the years and the thousands of procurements. But okay, very good.
You're right, Brian, because I remember someone protested like, hey, that you're not on Pacific time or Mountain time, and everyone should be thrown out except us because we turned it in on time. And they were wrong. They're like, no, you're actually on the wrong time zone. So you're right. We probably have seen other protests, but they were quickly thrown out because they had no merit. But yeah, there's no guarantee you're not going to get protested. But if you're open, you're fair and transparent, you should have no risk, no concerns.
Yeah, I would say I mean, I don't know the last time I've really worried about a protest in developing a procurement strategy. I feel pretty solid in that. Now, that said, we have been helping several states and other cities where they're currently seeing a protest in another procurement, and some advice there can always be warranted. Okay, second question for you that came up in the chat was, many different states or cities or municipalities, whatever the client group may be, especially in the public sector, they have different rules, they have different policies, they have different checkpoints and powers that be, that you have to go get approvals at various times in a particular order, and yada yada yada. So the question is, what's some of your experience in working with different cities, states, and localities that have all these different rules, and have you been able to take these types of concepts and apply them, even though we have some special snowflakes out there who have various rules that are very hard to work with in their own minds?
Yeah. Yeah, in 25 years of doing this, I've never worked with an organization that had a policy that goes against core procurement fundamentals, right? Which are to be open, to be fair, to be transparent, right? Those are kind of the core fundamentals that nearly every organization's procurement policies follow. So in terms of that, yeah, we don't have any issues. Now, some of them may have some unique policies within that. I don't know that I can remember something that's so unique where you couldn't implement any of these ideas, right? I've never seen a policy that says you're not allowed to do interviews. I've never seen a policy that says you cannot do less than 100 pages per proposal. All our proposals have to be over 100 pages, right? I've never seen those things. Now, even if there were, for those attending, if you know that you have something that is unique, that you can't do one of these things, that's fine. We don't do one of those items. But if you can do the other 6 or 7 items, that'll still help you maximize your probability of success than not doing any of them. If there is someone that's attending that knows of a specific policy that directly goes against any of these, let's chat about it right now if we have time. I mean, there are always ways to get around it, but I've never worked with any public or even private entity where we couldn't do the majority of these concepts.
Maybe that's a clarification as well that popped up in the chat. Is a lot of what you said sounds, lean, streamlined, and maybe something that is more in line with what can be done in a private organization. How, where have you seen this in the public side? Not naming names,
Yeah.
but just every example was from the public sector, correct?
Yeah. I would say the majority of our experience is in the public sector. So we've done this, maybe not ERPs, but we've done these types of procurements within the federal government, and that includes like the military, FAA, GSA, large scale federal agencies. We've done this statewide, many different states, cities, counties, schools, you name it. Once again, I don't know of any public organization that has specific rules that go against any of these concepts. But I could be wrong. There could be one out there. I just haven't worked with them yet.
Good question popped up here from Michelle. So in describing the two-step process for these larger software procurements that you went through, John, would it be a single RFP that's speaking to both of the steps? Would it be two separate RFPs, one for the software, one for the integrator?
Yeah.
I know there's different ways to do it, but in general, what have you found to be the best and the most clear?
Yeah, so this is probably one of those cases where your policy may dictate kind of how you have to roll this two-step out. So some organizations, you'll have to run this as a single RFP that has two components to it. But in most cases that I've done it, we've actually issued two different solicitations. So we've issued the first solicitation, which is actually more of an RFQ, which is a request for qualifications. So the RFQ is released, and what we'll do is we'll shortlist the top, like I said, 2 to 3 software products that are now pre-qualified. There is no like actual contract. It's now you have been pre-qualified. In the second step is we issue an RFP for the integrator. And within that RFP, it states that the only products you can implement as the integrator are the ones we pre-qualified through the RFQ. So that's how I would say most of the time we run this as two different solicitations, RFQ and RFP. But I have done it where it's been one RFP with just two different components. Both will work. Both will get you to the same outcome. It's just, what does your policy allow versus what it doesn't?
And if you did it as a single RFP, the best way, that's the best conceptual way maybe to think about it, is to just use the analogy of any type of shortlisting that you would typically do in a single RFP, or sometimes you shortlist before a presentation or a demo or something else. You're basically adding in an extra round of shortlist here, shortlisting down the software products and kind of switching focus a little bit across the broader team that's proposing.
Yeah.
Another question, John, was someone was asking, in what you talked about with some of the interview approaches, you made reference to individuals participating. What have you found to be most impactful from an interviewing standpoint, both in terms of who participates from the vendor side, and then, who's in the room from the client side and scoring that and asking the questions and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, another good question. I mean, that's probably a full 1 hour presentation by itself at some point. But to try and like summarize this in a couple minutes, I would say normally we would suggest the top 3 to 5 key individuals that are going to make or break the success of that procurement. Now, of course, everyone's important from the supplier side, right? But the supplier may have 100, 200 people. You can't interview everyone. So we would suggest identifying those top 3 to 5 people. And these are the daily points of contact. We don't want senior level, executive levels, business developers Those don't add value. So typically, no matter what you procure, you want your overall project manager, your daily point of contact. And then, like I said, it's probably 2 to 3 other individuals besides that main PM that are critical. So for like the ERP, it's the HR lead, the finance lead, maybe your change management. For a construction project, it could be the site superintendent, the electrical, the mechanical person, right? So it varies on what you're procuring, but keep it to, like I said, 3 to 5 individuals max. Then from the owner side, you can have your regular evaluators there. They don't have to be technical experts. They don't have to be subject matter experts, because your interview should be non-technical, right? Anyone should be able to sit in and identify if the person has expertise. So what sort of questions do you want to ask? I would ask the person that comes in, you can ask them their qualifications, experience. They're all going to say they're highly qualified. But then you want to ask them, hey, identify how you're going to implement this project. What's your plan and approach? Now, if the person has read your RFP and has done this a million times, they can get up and say, this is how I'm going to do it. If they don't, they're going to be like deer in a headlight, right? They're going to start saying, well, I don't really know the specifics, but here's kind of what I would do. That's a warning sign that, hey, they may have 20, 25 years of experience, but if they haven't read your RFP or thought about your specific requirements, that's a risk for you. So have them lay it out. Have them talk about the major risks and concerns, right? So for an ERP, what are the major risks, concerns, challenges that you run into running an ERP implementation? See what they say. We don't want generalities. We want specific risks related to their role. So like the HR person should be talking about HR risks, right? So there are things like that. And then you can ask, 1 or 2 maybe specific questions like, hey, we have a very unique data warehousing process within our state or within our city. How are you going to tackle that? Right. So you could ask specific questions. So that's kind of how I would frame it. Like I said, it's probably a 1-hour conversation of how to run interviews right. But generally, that's what you want to do. Focus on the top 3 or 5 people, interview them separately, not as a team, right? Because if you do as a team, someone's going to try and save the other person. So do it separately. And all you need is 30, 45 minutes.
Awesome, John.
I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Brian. I mean, you've run just as many interviews as I have, but.
No, I think the other thing I would say there is that when conducted in that general format, it's very easy to see reality for what it is in those interviews. Like you are going to get a fairly honest read on each individual, their capability, their experience, and their plan to deliver. If they're in overly marketing mode and they're trying to razzle dazzle you and bamboozle you with an awesome presentation, you can smell that so fast when you're asking the right questions. And you can there's options off of that, right? If they are unprepared, unable to do things, you'll know that as well. I think I'd shared in the chat one large software procurement that I was helping was for a payroll system. And we went through this type of an interview process. I think in that case, we had a core 4 individuals from the software providers that we were interviewing, or the implementation teams, and the project manager in particular for the implementation team just was a weak link in the interviews for various reasons. And we knew that. The rest of the team was good. They still won overall in combination with the software and the cost and all that good stuff. And we were in that pre-contract, clarification and negotiation step that John covered. And the client, and we said, hey, we know this is a red flag. We know this is a potential risk. Like we're pretty sure that project manager was not just weak, but extremely weak. And the client was like, I don't want to make anyone feel bad. And we just got to get going. We got to move forward. So don't worry about it. I don't want to stop and pause and have extra conversations to deal with this. So let's just good enough. Let's hope it doesn't bite us. Well, it bit us every step of the way. That individual was causing problems. And so that was my personal lesson learned of, if you can foresee that risk and you've got some evidence, even if it's like gut feel, in that case, it was more than gut feel, like we knew from that interview, don't overlook it. Don't try to talk yourself into it. It should be okay, or we'll probably get through this. Or you start getting into those words like should, could, maybe, probably, just bad. So that was my take on interviews. Okay. A couple other questions that popped up. I had a couple private messages to me asking for recording, like where the recordings of things will go afterwards. I'm going to just throw that link out there. It's the same centerforprocurement.org/RFP Doctor. And then when you go down, all the videos go up there. So every past RFP Doctor is there. They're all available to you. Just depends on how busy our team of volunteers is when we get the video up there, but usually within the next week or so, it gets posted. So take a look for that there. The next question, John, I'll see if I can get this right, because Kristen Shipper put a good question in here. It's a bit long, so make sure I'm interpreting it correctly. So the context would be when you were going through the software evaluation specifically, and you're looking at the list of requirements and how to actually try to evaluate that in more of an automatic scoring fashion. There are some different things you have to consider. One thing to consider is how important each of the requirements is to you. So is it a mandatory versus something that you really want to have? And there's kind of levels of your preference or priority as a client. And there's also aspects of the response where does the vendor have that as a built-in item, like off-the-shelf item, versus they got to set it up, customize it, they can't do it, and so forth. So how do you kind of balance both of those of communicating your preference or priority versus getting the proper type of responses from the vendor side? And maybe to sum up the question is like, how much is too much when you get into all of that?
No, good question. So, and I covered it very quickly, but in essence, the technical requirements you put together, you don't really have to change it that much from what you're going to do. So you can still have your 2000 requirements. I totally agree that some are more important than others. So the way some of my clients have done this is what we've done is we've taken the list of 1,000 and we've said, okay, which ones are like highly essential or pretty much deal breakers, right? And there's maybe out of the 1,000, 100 that are just super important. So we've actually taken those out and put them on a separate tab and said, these are highly desirable items. And we actually gave it more weight than the other items. And we said, like, these are weighted at 70% of the weight and everything else is weighted at 30%. So you could set it up that way. So you could have your highly desired, moderately desired, and then nice to haves, or you could just have highly desired and everything else. It's up to you how you want to set it up, but you can separate the list so that one set of requirements is actually weighted more importantly than the others. To the second part of the question, yes, I think I showed you an example. You can have more options than like out of the box customization versus not out of the box. I mean, you can put third party, so you can have other options and assign different point scales to it. But the point is, it allows you to quickly, in a touch of a button, analyze all 2,000 requirements versus having evaluators try to read every response and come out with a score. So you can come out with, customization versus out of the box versus third-party integration, right? You can come up with the scales, the options, and the points assigned to it.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.